Hello, I'm Riley, and this is the Diegetic Advancement Podcast. Okay, where did I leave off? Here's a quick summary of the points from last week. I'm happy for the game to be a game, but that doesn't mean the systems can't be believable. Believable advancement systems, or ones that are diegetic, can lead to improvements in the game and other areas of the game. I looked at systems in CAN, BX, and 5e to see if or how much their advancement was diegetic. And to get us to today's episode, I promised I'd actually demonstrate this. I'm going to use 5e for our example because I have the most problems with its advancement system, though it'll mostly still be applicable to a game like BX, and some of the systems I suggest could be bolted on to a game like CAN. Let's look at a wizard. They're not the worst culprits because their class abilities are pretty tame. Most of their advancement comes from their spells, which makes sense. Let's quickly review advancement and highlight some of the issues I have. Okay, how do we get XP and level up? By default, killing monsters. So combat skills going up is going to make sense. Alternatively, milestone XP is very popular, which is gaining XP or levels for completing story significant things like defeating a powerful enemy or getting a MacGuffin. So these systems aren't guaranteed to be diegetic, but as I mentioned last week, this is one place where I really don't care. Sure, we could tie gaining XP to actually using your abilities, maybe each time you succeed, but I'd rather use it as an incentive for play, like gold for XP or similar. But we can split the systems for gaining XP and the systems for leveling up. So the two problems I want to look at. One, there isn't a diegetic system for leveling up. Once you hit the XP required, you just level. And two, the amount of time it takes to go from level 1 to 20, following the rules for the adventuring day, is about 30 or 40. These systems, or lack thereof, are not believable or in the context of the fictional world. Before I get into solutions, let's continue our look at 5e. What do we get when we level up? Like all classes, upon leveling up, we're getting hit points, how good you are at not dying, proficiency bonus, getting better at things you're good at, attribute scores, likely improvements to intelligence, and optionally feats. For being a wizard, we get the ability to cast more and higher level spells. We automatically learn new spells, and depending on subclass, we get better at casting a school of magic. So what are the problems here? Assuming we're getting XP for combat, it makes sense that our combat stats go up. HP and proficiency, at least when it's applied to spells and saving throws. Getting better at casting makes sense too. We're almost certainly casting spells, and that applies to our attributes. Everything else is a little bit more questionable. Most notably, some feats might make sense, and then others grant you psychic abilities, for example. Where did they come from? And learning new spells. Where did you learn them from? Maybe you unlocked the knowledge in your mind, or were they already in your spellbook? But as I said last week, did you really have a wish spell at level 1? Other classes gain abilities that certainly aren't diegetic, like creating an echo of yourself. As I said, the wizard is fairly tame. Lastly, I mentioned the fact that levels don't really mean anything other than the sort of abstract power level. It's not a massive problem, but something to consider going forward. So let's get into solutions. I'm going to present a few options, and these aren't the only solutions, but they will provide useful framing for what benefits we can get from them. There are three solutions: a system for generating characters, a system for training, and a system for gaining abilities. We'll tackle each of these one at a time. Firstly, training. The training rules from AD&D will likely work just fine. Once you've accumulated enough experience points, you spend some gold and time and you can advance. This solves a number of problems. All our skills going up now make sense, even if we didn't use them all to gain XP. We can explain some of the new abilities we might unlock. It also solves the issue of how long it takes to level up from 1 to 20, and a common issue, at least from online discourse, of what to do with all the gold PCs accumulate. You're likely saying, this is all pretty boring though. So why do I say it can improve your game? Well, this system doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you're a wizard who needs to train in order to gain power and the next set of abilities, how would they do that? Would they need a mentor, a library or school, or some other faction to help? Yes, they likely would. So by adding training, we've added a bunch of locations, NPCs, and factions that ties the PC to the fictional world. This can serve as a source of hirelings and replacements if your character dies, a source of hooks and calls to adventure, or a reason to travel to a city or other location for training. Training also takes time. In a game where there's no need to ever spend more than a day's rest, now we have a reason to, and we can promote other aspects of play, downtime activities, the social or political game. Now that going from level 1 to 20 doesn't take a little over a month, the world has time to breathe. We can include rumours of events long before they happen, political unrest before a war, or goblins coming down from the mountains before a dragon awakes. And lastly, it feels like the player and the player character has a hand in that character's progression, promoting the sense of reward. But unlocking all your abilities or feats just from training might not be the best way to go about it. So let's jump to the next option, systems for gaining abilities. I'll read a section from the DCC rulebook here, titled Questing for the Impossible. In quote, modern role-playing games contain a surfeit of rules defining spells, rituals, feats, and other mechanics for all manner of supernatural accomplishments. Raising the dead, improving an ability score, gaining weapon skill, receiving a divine boon are acts of dice rolling and nothing more. The DCC RPG argues against this approach, and instead makes one simple request of both player and judge. Follow the examples set by mythology and fiction and resolve such acts with a quest. End quote. So it sounds like DCC is arguing for the same thing I am. And I'll admit this section did inspire me when I first read it. I think the most important part is that D&D is about having adventures, so why would we not have the mechanics of the game drive us to adventure? There are some good examples listed after, which I'll read a few. Raise the dead. Journey to the lands of the dead and recover the lost soul, possibly by dancing, gaming, or jousting with Death himself, which they recommend a DCC module which is inspired by the Fafid and the Greymouser Lankmar story. Tame a dragon mount. Simply steal a dragon's egg and raise it from birth. Or to tame an adult dragon, find the eggshell from which it hatched, which most dragons secure in a secret location. So, we're going to run into some conflict with the 5e rules here. A lot of the awesome abilities characters get occur naturally, so getting them behind specific adventures is a shift away from how 5e works. Still, if you're not brave enough to take things away from your players, additional abilities can be gained via quest, especially if the quest is initiated by the player asking how they can get something. Though I see 5e's system as restraining, others find it provides a framework, so use that framework to inspire adventure. This obviously fixes some of the issues I highlighted earlier, and hopefully it's also obvious how this can improve the play experience. Lastly, generating characters. Using the training rules and what I like to call quest for it rules, we've generated a rich world full of adventure that the characters and mechanics exist in. But where does this come from? Or how or when should we generate it? We can lean in on 5e's framework here. If your player wants to play a monk, there must be a monastery somewhere, and perhaps there are ancient relics that show the forms for unlocking their key to perform the higher level abilities scattered about the world. So collaborative world building isn't everyone's cup of tea, and lengthy character creation process is not ideal. That's why I mentioned training providing a source of replacements. Though I think there can be a system of character generation that supports these diegetic mechanics and is still fun and exciting. Traveller does a great job of this, and modifying that system to fit your world is a great way to go about character generation. Luckily, Joe from the Dekahedron podcast has already started this work for you. I'll link to the podcast where he talks about that in the show notes. That's where I'm going to leave the discussion on diegetic advancement for now. I'd love to hear your feedback on this though, so feel free to call in and share your thoughts or ask questions. Thank you for listening to my ramblings these past 2 shows, and probably more in the future. For now, I'll continue on with the regular segments. Okay, I'm running a touch long, so I think I'll do another midweek episode to update on my Wargame and DCC campaign, and cover a couple more call-ins. So that leaves a product showcase, and some content shoutouts. Jumping into the product showcase, I've been talking about Matrix gaming a little bit on the show, mainly in response to recommendations from Sam, but I had wondered if there were any RPGs that leaned into this as a core mechanic. Whilst I still can't think of any, and I'd love to hear from anyone who knows of one, I was reminded of a game called the Indie Hack, and I wanted to give a brief overview of its mechanic, which has some similarities. Okay, so the core mechanic is built around details, and it's easier if I just read a section from the book than try to explain it myself. Using the indie hack, you'll be telling stories with lots of interesting, strange, and/or frightening details. Details are properties or conditions, e.g., the sword that you dig up in an ancient battlefield might have the details rusty and dull. Details are written down when they are added to a character, scene, enemy, or item. Details are crossed out when they no longer hold true. Adding details. Hard details are added when rolling the dice and describe a fundamental change to some property of a person, place, or a thing, e.g., dealing damage, changing an object, annoying someone. In point form, note down all the hard details added to a character, weapon, enemy, etc. E.g., when a player says I slash it with my sword, rolls and is over by 2, and therefore has one hard detail to spend, add a detail like deep incision to the monster. The player won the challenge by rolling and being over 2. The effect of that victory is represented by a change to the monster in the form of a hard detail. End quote. There are also soft details and scene details, and they're typically negative or positive. The core mechanic is that you roll 2 dice, 1 light and 1 dark, and if the light die is higher, then the player wins. If the dark die is higher, the GM wins. And the degree of difference dictates how many details that the player or GM gets to add. Typically, challenges have a capacity, a certain number of details, hard details that they can have before they're defeated or overcome. And then these details can be exploited to give bonuses to the dice. Similarity here, though it might not actually be all that strong, is that the game is played by constructing details, similar to a Matrix game is about just constructing arguments. And those details can be used in further detailing to gain an advantage, which is similar to if you use an appropriate argument, then the DM is going to give you a better, um, a stronger argument and a bonus. So when the game master sets a scene and details the scene, the players can use those details as arguments to give their actions bonuses, and then they can add details of their own, which can then be exploited by the game master or other players. A lot of the mechanics, or at least the genre, will feel quite familiar to anyone who's played Dungeons and Dragons, especially old school. But it's just reframed into using details instead of everything else. Really cool game. I'm pretty sure it's fairly cheap to pick up on itch. That'll be linked in the description below. Really cool system. I think it kind of fits in with Matrix gaming, as I said, but also some of the conversations that have been going on about skill systems and how they can be used. So, recommend you to check it out. And to close out the show, as I want to say always, but most of the time, some content shoutouts. A couple of podcasts about the upcoming Anchorpocalypse Take 2. Evil Jeff over at the Minions and Musings podcast has been talking about his shared world building recently. Really interesting to listen to. And on the most recent episode, he also talks about how his podcast might be affected. Rob from Down in the Heap podcast also talks about how his podcast might be affected. Looks like he might be overcoming some technical issues that have been plaguing him recently, and so he's answering some call-ins. There are a couple of shows from Mirke over the Meek podcast that I want to call out. I'll only link to one, but here's an open call out for what people might need to help them podcast, tools and software, and calls for his Delicious in Dungeon call-in show due by the 29th of Feb. Jason has a number of call-ins and leverages his connections to get an all-star panel to answer a call from Mirke on what edition of old school D&D or its retro clones should he play or read. And lastly, KR and Daniel talk about DCC finals. I feel an episode of my own on that topic coming up. If anyone is listening, I'd love to hear your feedback. You can reach me via Spotify, SpeakPipe, Discord, or email. Details, along with everything I've talked about today, are in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.